You ever been in a schoolyard scrap? A little shoving, maybe a clumsy headlock? Now imagine that, except it's 15,000 years ago, and the winner gets food, respect, and maybe a shot at survival. That's wrestling, the world's oldest combat sport, born from pure instinct, sharpened by warriors, and turned into one of the wildest spectacles on earth. Oh, and before we jump into the history, thanks to Suites for becoming the first OG fighter member. Let's go. Wrestling was not just carved into history. It was history. The Sumerians around 3000 BCE were already immortalizing their grappling duels in stone, proving that this wasn't just a pastime. It was ritual, training, and maybe even a way to score divine favor. India's warriors took it further with Malayuddha, a brutal submission-heavy style that shaped combat sports for centuries. Over in China, the Yellow Emperor's troops were tossing each other around with shuai jiao, refining the art of controlled violence both for war and dominance. Egypt got in on the action as well. The tombs of Beni Hassan are practically an ancient grappling manual, showing over 400 moves, throws, pins, joint locks that wouldn't look out of place in an MMA fight. The Mayans? Wrestling was woven into the ritual blood sports because in Mesoamerica, competition often had a final score of life versus death. Then came the Greeks, turning wrestling into something near sacred. The Olympics introduced pale, a pure wrestling discipline, while pancration removed all of the soft edges, strikes, submissions, and just one rule: no eye gouging. The Romans absorbed and modified Greek techniques, creating Greco-Roman wrestling, where leg attacks were out and upper body power was everything. And then there was Milo of Croton, six-time Olympic champion, myth in the making, and eventually a little too slick for his own good. Literally, he tried oiling himself up so opponents could not grip him. The judges? Not amused, disqualified. Even in ancient Greece, cheating had limits. Meanwhile, the Persians blended strength with spirituality in Zorkana wrestling, a fusion of combat and discipline that's still alive in Iranian wrestling today. The Etruscans were organizing matches before Rome even mattered. Then came one of history's pettiest royal showdowns, King Henry VIII versus King Francis I, 1520, at the Field of the Cloth of Gold. Henry, big, brash, convinced of his own dominance. Francis, quicker, smarter, and not about to lose. The French king flipped Henry onto his back in seconds. The English king, furious. A rare moment where royalty had to eat some very public humiliation. By the time empires had risen and fallen, wrestling had already spread across the world, adapting to the cultures, landscapes, and warriors who practiced it. In the icy north, Viking warriors honed their combat skills through Glima, a style that valued agility just as much as brute force. It focused more onto the technique, flipping your opponent while staying on your feet, because in battle, slipping on the ice meant losing more than just a match. Meanwhile, over in England, wrestling was festival entertainment. Cornish and Cumberland wrestling turned into a staple of local fairs, drawing crowds eager to watch competitors hurl each other to the ground in tests of raw power. Farther east, China's shuai jiao was sharpening itself into something deadlier. Under the Tang dynasty, wrestling turned into a battlefield preparation. Soldiers trained to toss enemies off horses, rip them off their feet in seconds, and control them before a sword ever had to be drawn. Similar tactics were embraced in medieval Europe, where knights drilled in grappling as part of their close quarters combat training. If a knight was unhorsed, his ability to wrestle could mean survival. In the Ottoman Empire, Turkish oil wrestling took a different turn. Wrestlers slathered themselves in olive oil, making it nearly impossible to grab hold of them. A contest of strength, endurance, and sheer grit. It's remained one of the oldest continuously practiced styles in history. Meanwhile, across the seas, Japan's sumo wrestling evolved from Shinto rituals into a spectacle that would define an entire culture, while lamb wrestling in Africa kept alive combat traditions older than most written records. Wherever there were warriors, there was wrestling. It was evolving, mutating, becoming something bigger than sport. It was identity, culture, and in some cases, survival. By the 1700s, wrestling was outgrowing village fairs and battlefield brawls. Rules got stricter, styles got sharper, and the sport started taking shape. In northern England, Lancashire catch wrestling took traditional folk wrestling and turned it into a brutal chess match. No elegant throws, just savage takedowns, crushing joint locks, and submissions that ended fights in seconds. This was the blueprint for pro wrestling and modern MMA. Meanwhile, in India, Pehlwani wrestling hit a new peak with Gama the Great. Undefeated, untouchable, and built like a human wrecking ball. Gama crushed wrestlers across Europe and Asia. His dominance was not just impressive, it was terrifying. France refined its own brand of grappling with lutte parisienne, a mix of strength and precision that shaped European wrestling. But while some focused on discipline, others cranked up the chaos. Carnival wrestling was an all-comers blood sport where fighters took on challengers for cash and bragging rights. One wrestler even fought 100 people in a single day because apparently pacing yourself was for cowards. Then came the Olympic stage. Greco-Roman wrestling kicked things off in 1896, dragging the sport back to its ancient roots. In 1904, freestyle wrestling broke the mold, adding leg attacks and upping the speed. Wrestling was not just tradition anymore, it was a global event. And just when things seemed settled, America turned wrestling into a full-blown obsession. Frank Gotch versus George Hackenschmidt in 1908 was the match that changed everything. Hackenschmidt was a machine, but Gotch dragged him through a punishing, hours-long war of attrition and walked out the winner. The rematch in 1911 packed arenas and cemented wrestling's place as a spectacle. And then, because history is ridiculous, Dan O'Mahony wrestled a bear in 1936. Why? Who knows? Maybe wrestling humans got boring. Oh, and by the way, if you like this content, consider joining as a member to get early access to new videos, being able to influence future videos, as well as chipping in for my morning coffee so I can make better videos for you. By the 1920s, wrestling was not just about who was the strongest. It was about who could put on a show. The stakes were not just in the ring anymore. Audiences wanted drama, spectacle, and larger-than-life characters. Wrestling was about to shift from competition to entertainment, and three men, Toots Mondt, Ed Strangler Lewis, and Belly Sando were about to change everything. Together, they formed the Gold Dust Trio. And they did not just tweak the rules, they rewrote the whole game. Scripted finishes, timed matches, predetermined winners. It all started here. The days of endless, grind-it-out grappling were over. Now, the action was fast-paced, the wrestlers had distinct personas, and every match told a story. They called it slam-bang Western-style wrestling, and it became the foundation of modern pro wrestling. By 1937, wrestling threw another curveball, the first ever cage match in Atlanta. No escape, no interference, just two fighters locked in with nothing but steel and bad intentions. It was an instant hit, paving the way for decades of brutal showdowns. Meanwhile, Japan had its own revolution. Enter Riki Dozen, a former sumo who humiliated foreign opponents, turning every match into a national statement. He turned pro wrestling into a cultural phenomenon, laying the foundation for Japanese puroresu. Across the pond, the UK had its own wrestling boom. World of Sport ruled British TV from the 50s to the 80s, with larger-than-life bruisers like Big Daddy and Giant Haystacks packing arenas. British wrestling was technical, gritty, and wildly popular. Pure entertainment with a stiff uppercut. Then came Madison Square Garden, 1957. The match got so intense the crowd snapped. Chairs flew, fists followed, and before security could react, it was a full-scale riot. Wrestling may have been scripted, but the chaos that night was 100% real. By the mid-90s, pro wrestling turned into a war. Two giants, WWE and WCW, locked into a ratings battle so ruthless it would define an entire era. It was must-see television, week after week, as WCW's Monday Nitro and WWE's Raw fought for dominance. It was Hulk Hogan and the NWO rewriting the rules, flipping the good guy, bad guy dynamic on its head. It was The Rock electrifying arenas, Stone Cold flipping off the boss, and DX telling the world to suck it. This was not just wrestling, it was rebellion, attitude, and pure chaos. WCW had a secret weapon, Lucha Libre. The high-flying style of Rey Mysterio, Eddie Guerrero, and Ultimo Dragon introduced gravity-defying moves to American audiences. They were not giants, but they moved like lightning, bringing an acrobatic intensity that changed the game. Suddenly, wrestling was not just about size, it was about speed, agility, and innovation. Meanwhile, over in ECW, hardcore was not just a term, it was a way of life. Barbed wire, flaming tables, unprotected chair shots, and matches that looked more like crime scenes than wrestling bouts. ECW was not for the faint of heart, and it built a rabid underground following, pushing WWE and WCW to get even more extreme. Then came the moment WCW self-destructed. The finger poke of doom. January 4th, 1999. Kevin Nash, WCW champion, squared up against Hulk Hogan, and then took a fake poke to the chest and fell like he had been shot. Hogan pinned him, just like that. The fans, already frustrated, checked out. WCW never recovered. And then the moment wrestling fans still can't explain. Mae Young, a legendary female wrestler, giving birth to a rubber hand. In 2000, WWE leaned all the way into the absurd. Mark Henry, her supposed baby daddy, looked as confused as the audience. Was there a reason for this? No. Was it legendary? Absolutely. This era was unpredictable, reckless, and completely insane. It was wrestling at its peak madness, and no one could look away. The Monday Night Wars ended, WCW was buried, and WWE had the wrestling world in a headlock. But dominance breeds complacency, and by the early 2000s, fans were getting restless. Then came four names that would redefine wrestling's future. John Cena, Brock Lesnar, Batista, and Randy Orton. They were the next era, young, athletic, and hungry. Cena turned hustle, loyalty, and respect into a billion-dollar empire. Lesnar was a freak of nature, an NCAA champion who looked like he was carved out of granite and fought like a machine. Batista brought sheer power, while Orton, dripping arrogance, became the legend killer. By 2005, they owned the industry. But wrestling was not the only fight in town. MMA exploded, and suddenly wrestling's toughest guys wanted in. Lesnar left, stormed into UFC, and became the heavyweight champion. CM Punk tried his luck. Did not go so well. Then came Ronda Rousey, the first woman to headline a UFC event, who flipped the switch and became a wrestling megastar. The line between real and scripted fighting blurred. Meanwhile, WWE was chasing money. Big money. In 2018, they inked a deal with Saudi Arabia, launching Crown Jewel, a series of events buried in controversy. Human rights issues, political backlash, wrestlers refusing to go, fans were not happy. But the checks were too big to ignore. And just when wrestling needed a new spark, along came The Fiend. Bray Wyatt did not just wrestle, he haunted the ring. His eerie mask, the split personality, the Firefly funhouse, it was something fresh, unsettling, and brilliant. Until WWE, in classic fashion, ruined it. But wrestling does not live in the past, it feeds off what's next. The future is already taking shape, and it looks unpredictable, chaotic, and exactly what the sport needs. AEW is pushing WWE harder than anyone has in decades, forcing Vince McMahon's empire to evolve or die trying. International wrestling, from Japan's NJPW to Mexico's Lucha Libre, keeps expanding its influence, making stars before WWE can even get to them. Women's wrestling is no longer a sideshow, it's main eventing WrestleMania, headlining pay-per-views, and proving that the biggest fights don't need to be defined by gender. Wrestling has never stood still. It evolves, reinvents, crashes, and rises again. And if history tells us anything, the next chapter will be just as insane.